The UFC has always been a hub for controversial incidents, which quickly spark public outrage. This time, the head of the organization, Dana White, had found himself under extreme scrutiny after a leaked video caught him in the act of slapping his wife. Usually, such actions would be met with swift action, but so far there's been nothing. If you'd like to know what fans think about this silence, stick around. First up, fans think white privilege is protecting white. Because news channels and social media have been so silent on the incident and haven't even criticized Dana White for his actions, fans have been quick to claim that ESPN's hesitation to address the contentious situation in any way is only due to white privilege. Because of his race, some people think ESPN is just covering a portion of Dana White's domestic abuse incident. After a video of the UFC president smacking his wife on New Year's Eve surfaced, it sparked widespread criticism, which was expected. Because his wife Anne hit him first, some people have justified Dana, but others believe there's no justification for domestic violence. Many people also feel that the more well-known news sources, particularly ESPN, which has a direct partnership with the UFC, are trying to avoid talking too much about the subject. So fans have taken to Twitter to talk about how differently Dana is being treated. One user argued that there's actual evidence for the slap and not just gossip. So why wasn't ESPN talking about the matter? He demanded that the channel treat White just like they would have if the man had been black. Another user compared Dana White's case to Floyd's to demonstrate that white privilege still exists. Some fans even brought up Will Smith and wondered how his slap garnered so much more attention when he was defending his wife. White, who had attacked his wife, didn't seem to be as big of a deal. Next up, Dana White's domestic violence remarks resurface. Way before the broadcast of the New Year's Eve footage, Dana White was vehemently opposed to all instances of domestic abuse, including the expulsion of Luis Pena from the UFC in 2021. Speaking about a man beating a woman, the UFC president had stated in 2014 that there was one thing that someone could never bounce back from, and that was from touching a lady. He had added that the UFC dealt with such matters harshly since the day he had arrived. There was just no way to recover from it. Now, he's in the same position, but it looks like the rules don't apply to you if you're running everything. Coming up, the Super Bowl winner makes a forceful message against media bias. After the horrifying physical incident with his wife, White made his first appearance in front of the media soon after. He asserted that he's dealing with the guilt of his actions and will have to live with what he did. But two-time Super Bowl champion Torrey Smith disagrees though. He reminded everyone that people aren't particularly concerned about domestic violence, but when some famous people do it, it makes them think about it and forces them to care. But if those actions were committed by people in positions of authority, they were free to act however they liked, and people would generally keep quiet and forget too. This is why he felt that Dana White was being kept out of the news. Had White been an athlete with lower influence in the UFC, they would attempt to get him expelled from the league altogether. Smith even stressed that members of the mainstream media should be ashamed of themselves for failing to cover the incident. He calls out media personalities for failing to report on the important matter. Their lack of speech was telling. That didn't mean that he wanted White persecuted. In fact, he's a big proponent of showing mercy, but a mistake of this scale should have been met with some kind of consequences. Instead, they just let him off the hook. Torrey Smith closed his argument by saying that he thought people should be held accountable for their actions, rather than being publicly scorned or fired for their actions. Next, Stephen Smith thinks White ought to punish himself. Dana White has been urged by Stephen A. Smith to discipline himself for hitting his wife. On First Take, Smith spoke about the situation and urged White to treat himself with the same level of discipline as he would one of his fighters. He felt that it was necessary because the world had to be reminded that, as a man, they should not even think of hitting a lady. You must not do that, Smith admonished. Dana White was aware of this, seeing that he spoke about it earlier. Smith reminded everyone that the head of the UFC had already criticized such behavior, but why was he facing no punishment or penalties? White needed to do the same as he would had another fighter made such a mess of things and not just avoid dealing with the consequences of his actions. Moving on, Smith revealed that he's tight with White. Dana White is more than just a person with connections to the world of athletics, according to Smith. They're actually friends, and Smith even thinks of the man as a nice one. That's why it was so hard for him to talk about White's behavior. The two talk to each other regularly, and since the video was made public, they spoke for a very short time. According to Smith, Dana understood that it was hard for his friend to talk about the slap, but despite how hard it was, White and his family are in a terrible, very embarrassing situation. Therefore, his heart went out to them. Smith revealed that White also stressed that he had never ever done something like this before, but he would make no more excuses for what he did because the UFC president was so humiliated and disgusted with himself for being in this position. He couldn't believe that he was in a situation where everyone was talking about how he had hit the lady he had been married to for 30 years. years and who is the mother of his 3 children. Smith ended it all by saying that it was crucial in this case to remember that this hadn't happened before and that the family was trying to move past it. Following up, what did Dana say about the fight? After the incident involving his wife, White expressed regret in an interview with TMZ. He tried to explain himself, but stated that, unfortunately, that's what happened. He reminded everyone that they'd all heard him say for years that there is never ever a justification for a guy to touch a woman, and he's one of those guys who still believes this, but he'd messed up and was now talking about it on TMZ. White has been married to Anne for almost 30 years, and they've known each other since they were just 12 years old. They've undoubtedly experienced some difficult times together and had made it through it all with their 3 children. This was just another awful situation for them to get by. Although he was humiliated, this was one of those instances where their children were a larger concern to the pair. At this time, they wanted to focus on their family. Next, White announced that there will be no repercussions for his actions. White said that there have been internal discussions about the incident, including with ESPN, and that he has already been coping with his punishment as a result of the incident and will do so indefinitely. In fact, Dana baffled everyone when he questioned what punishment he should take. If they wanted him to be suspended or removed from the UFC, it wouldn't affect him one bit. He reminded them that he had told them that he could have easily sat through COVID had it lasted 10 years, unlike the majority who were greatly hurt by the pandemic. If he was suspended, it'd hurt the players, the organization, and his workers, but not him. The UFC would suffer in his absence. What else do they want him to do? He was reflecting on the matter and wasn't denying that he had been in the wrong. He admitted his mistake, and that was his punishment. To be forever labeled as someone who had hit his wife was punishment enough. Plus, many of his friends, fighters, and competitors would no longer respect him the way they had before. He'd have to deal with the consequences of his actions for the rest of his life, which he thought was a much worse punishment than, say, taking a 30 or 60-day vacation. Coming up, fighters are unhappy with the lack of action. Not everyone with ties to the biggest mixed martial arts organization in the world was pleased with White's remarks. Ramsey Nijem, a former UFC fighter, made fun of White's remarks later that day by referencing the 9-month suspension he received for testing positive for marijuana in 2019 while he was signed to the Professional Fighters League. He felt it would be better to be known as a pot user instead of being suspended for 9 months from competing. Nijem was sure he could have lived with that. Al La Quinta, a former lightweight championship contender for the UFC, posted shortly after. He had been suspended from getting any winning bonuses for the next 3 fights because he'd wrecked a hotel room and cursed at some of the fans. He too felt that the punishment should have been set aside because being known as a crowd-cursing hotel wrecker was far from worse. Finally, has Mrs. White remarked about the situation? Anne White was quick to respond to the video and curb some of the criticism aimed at her husband. She was horrified by the video and blamed the alcohol they'd consumed at the New Year's party. She added that she's been with Dana for 3 decades and never once had anything like this happen before. It was completely out of character for him to act the way he did, and even that was an understatement. She blamed herself as well, saying that both sides were to blame for what happened. They'd both apologized to one another and hoped to move past it, and she sincerely hoped that the public would give them the space to deal with their kids in private. Dana, too, mentioned that he and his wife had apologized to each other. At this time, he didn't care what anyone else was saying because he had to prioritize his family. That's a wrap for this video. Do you think White's white privilege can help him avoid punishment? Let us know in the comments below. Make sure to give this video a thumbs up and subscribe to our channel for more videos like this. See you in the next one.